The sun dipped low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the small, sleepy town of Ridgeview. It was a place where change came slowly, like the rusted trucks parked along dusty streets or the leaves that clung stubbornly to ancient oak trees. Dylan Everett leaned against the side of his father's workshop, wiping sweat from his brow with a worn handkerchief. The air smelled faintly of sawdust and motor oil, familiar scents that had followed him since childhood. His father, Mark, owned a small business repairing everything from farm equipment to the occasional curious gadget that came from beyond Earth's atmosphere. This was Ridgeview's secret, one that most of its residents weren't even aware of. The townsfolk knew Mark as a quiet, somewhat eccentric man who kept to himself, but in reality he'd once been a diplomat, a man who had traveled among the stars, brokering alliances with beings from distant worlds. That part of his life, however, was hidden away like an old, dusty photograph until that day when the past came rushing back in the form of an unexpected message. Dylan wiped his hands on his jeans and made his way inside. Mark was hunched over the workbench, a thin beam of sunlight illuminating the silver strands in his hair. A holographic message hovered above a metallic orb, the light pulsing with a rhythmic hum. Dylan had seen these kinds of messages before, usually from clients wanting custom repairs on alien tech, but this one was different. His father's usually stoic face bore an expression Dylan had rarely seen, a mixture of nostalgia and nervous anticipation. "Dad?" Dylan asked, stepping closer, his boots clunking on the concrete floor. Mark straightened, turning to face him. "You remember Zyler, don't you? I told you about him once." Dylan furrowed his brow, searching his memory. "You mean the alien diplomat you used to work with, from, that planet with the purple trees?" Mark allowed himself a small smile. "Yes, exactly. From Kaliara. He's coming here to Earth, and he's bringing his daughter." Dylan blinked, momentarily caught off guard. It wasn't every day that an old friend from light years away dropped by for a visit. "Why now? It's been, 20 years since you last saw him?" Mark sighed, his gaze drifting back to the message. The holographic figure of Zyler spoke in the rhythmic, melodic tones of the Kaliaran language, a language Mark understood well but which Dylan could only grasp the occasional word of. "He's on a cultural exchange mission. He thinks there's still much Earth could learn, and much he could learn from Earth. He wants Arya, his daughter, to experience life here." Dylan could sense a tension in his father's voice, a hint of unease. "And you're nervous about this, why?" So Mark glanced at his son, his expression softening. "It's not every day you have to explain to an old friend why Earth's changed so much. Ashoma. And there's always the question of whether we're as ready to accept visitors as we like to think we are. Not everyone sees past the differences." Dylan shrugged, trying to dispel the weight of the conversation. "Well, it'll be nice to meet some new people, or aliens, I guess. Might shake things up a bit." Mark let out a chuckle, the sound carrying a touch of bitterness. "You have no idea, kid." 2 weeks later, the day of Zyler's arrival dawned bright and clear, the sky a deep shade of blue that seemed to stretch endlessly above Ridgeview. The entire town buzzed with whispers of a special event, though few knew the exact nature of it. Mark had carefully orchestrated Zyler's arrival to take place outside town limits, at an old clearing surrounded by tall pines where curious eyes couldn't easily peek. Dylan and his father stood in the clearing, waiting. The air was thick with anticipation, the kind that made Dylan shift restlessly on his feet. "So how are they getting here?" he asked, casting a glance at the empty sky. "Beaming down. A spaceship? Something else?" Before Mark could answer, the air shimmered with a low hum that seemed to resonate through Dylan's bones. A silver vessel appeared, materializing with a fluidity that made it seem as though it had always been there, just waiting to be seen. The ship was sleek and elegant, a craft shaped like a crescent moon with luminescent veins that pulsed softly across its surface. Dylan's breath caught in his throat. He had seen sketches of such ships in his father's old notebooks, but witnessing one in person was an entirely different experience. It was like seeing a myth come to life. The ship's surface rippled, and a hatch slid open. Zyler emerged first, tall and regal, with the unmistakable presence of someone who had once shaped the fate of worlds. His skin had the faintest violet hue, shimmering like the sky at twilight. His eyes, wide and almond-shaped, glowed with a gentle luminescence. He carried himself with the poise of a seasoned diplomat, every movement precise, like a dance practiced for centuries. Dylan swallowed, feeling suddenly small in the presence of such an otherworldly being. But Zyler's expression softened as he spotted Mark, and in an instant they embraced, the barriers of time and distance melting away. "It has been too long, old friend," Xyler said, his voice carrying a musical cadence even in English. "Much has changed." Mark nodded, a rare warmth in his voice, "and some things never do." So then Xyler turned, and from behind him stepped a figure that took Dylan's breath away. Aria, his daughter, was a vision of alien elegance. Her skin, a pale blue with iridescent undertones, caught the light like the surface of a pearl. Her long hair, the color of stardust, flowed behind her, catching the breeze. Her eyes were striking, a deep indigo that seemed to hold entire galaxies within them. She met Dylan's gaze, and he found himself staring, momentarily forgetting how to form words. Aria tilted her head slightly, a curious smile playing at the corners of her lips. "Hello, Dylan," she said, her voice like a breeze rustling through chimes, with a faint echo that hinted at thoughts passing just beneath the surface. Dylan felt a rush of nerves stumbling over his response. Hi, nice to meet you." Aria's smile widened slightly, revealing teeth that glinted like opals. "Father speaks highly of your world. I am eager to understand it for myself." Dylan nodded, feeling his ears grow warm. He quickly busied himself by helping with their luggage, or what he assumed was luggage, a series of smooth, orb-like containers that shimmered with shifting colors. Aria watched him with a bemused expression, as if observing an unfamiliar species in its natural habitat. As the sun dipped lower, casting long golden beams through the trees, the group made their way back to the Everett home. The alien guests settled into the house with surprising ease, unpacking strange devices and artifacts, some of which adjusted themselves to the earthly environment with a series of clicks and whirs. Over dinner, a meal of earthly fare mixed with Kaliaran delicacies that Xyler had brought as gifts, the conversation flowed between nostalgia and new discoveries. Dylan found himself stealing glances at Aria, captivated by the way she delicately tasted earth food, her expression shifting from curiosity to delight. There was something mesmerizing about her, a presence that seemed to transcend the physical. After dinner, Aria asked Dylan to show her around the town. Though Mark and Xyler exchanged wary glances, they allowed it, perhaps trusting that the quiet streets of Ridgeview held little threat. They walked through the twilight streets, the air cool and fragrant with the scent of pine. Dylan pointed out the local diner, the old library, the crumbling movie theater that no longer played films but served as a meeting place for local teenagers. Aria took it all in with wide eyes, asking questions that ranged from the mundane to the profound, like why humans found meaning in stars that were already dead, or why some people's hearts seemed so closed while others wore their emotions on their sleeves. Dylan found himself opening up in ways he hadn't expected, sharing his dreams of one day leaving Ridgeview, of exploring beyond Earth, beyond the confines of the only world he'd ever known. Aria listened intently, her gaze never wavering, as if she was seeing past the words to the core of his thoughts. They reached the edge of town, where the land sloped down into a wide meadow. The sky above was a deep navy, scattered with stars that twinkled like 1,000 distant lanterns. Aria turned her face toward the sky, her eyes reflecting the starlight. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "Your world is so small, yet so vast in its own way." Dylan found himself standing closer to her than he had intended, their shoulders nearly touching. He followed her gaze, feeling a sudden sense of longing, as if he was on the edge of something vast and unknown. "Yeah," he murmured, his voice barely a whisper. "It is." They stood there side by side, looking up at the stars, neither of them aware that the events of that night would set their lives on a course neither could have ever imagined. The arrival of Xyler and Aria had brought more than just a cultural exchange. It had brought a quiet, pulsing change, one that echoed in the space between the stars and in the hearts of two young souls finding their way to each other. The days following Xyler and Aria's arrival slipped by with an odd, dreamlike quality. Ridgeview adjusted to the presence of its unusual visitors in its own quiet way. Most of the townsfolk remained blissfully unaware of the extraterrestrial presence among them, attributing the strange lights over the forest to military exercises or weather balloons. A few noticed the sleek silver vehicle that sometimes darted through the night sky, but no one quite dared to investigate. Dylan, however, felt his world had tilted on its axis, and he was navigating this new reality with a mix of exhilaration and dread. Aria settled into Earth life with a surprising grace, though not without moments of wide-eyed wonder and occasional cultural missteps. She found Earth's gravity a curious challenge stronger than what she was used to. It made her movements slightly slower, more deliberate. Yet she adapted quickly, her natural agility and innate curiosity helping her adjust. Her fascination with Earth's simplest things, from the texture of pine cones to the sound of cicadas humming through the night, was both charming and strange to Dylan. It was as if she saw the world with the eyes of someone who had only ever glimpsed it from afar. Mark and Zyler spent their days in the workshop or on walks through the woods, discussing the state of the world and the diplomatic currents that had shifted since their last meeting. Zyler's deep voice would carry through the trees, speaking of the challenges facing the interstellar alliance, of new threats from other worlds, and of hopes for deeper understanding between their species. Mark, in turn, shared Earth's struggles, its internal divisions, its slow acceptance of the larger universe beyond its atmosphere. It was a bittersweet reunion, full of the weight of old memories and the shadows of the future. But for Dylan and Arya, the days were filled with a different kind of exploration. The one afternoon, as sunlight slanted through the trees, Dylan found Arya standing at the edge of a creek behind the workshop. She had taken off her shoes and waded into the water, the hem of her flowing, iridescent dress trailing behind her. Her hair caught the sunlight, turning it into a cascade of shimmering silver. "Hey, Arya," Dylan called, stepping closer, feeling a warmth he couldn't quite name when she turned to look at him. "Hello, Dylan," she replied, a smile tugging at her lips. Her voice carried that soft, melodic echo, as if two voices spoke in unison, one that he could hear, and another that seemed to hum in the space between thoughts. "This stream, it is different than the waters of my home. There is a sweetness to it, a simplicity." Dylan chuckled, leaning against a tree. "I don't know about that. It's just a creek, not exactly something that makes it into tourist brochures." Arya's gaze remained on the flowing water, a wistful look crossing her features. "You underestimate what is beautiful, Dylan. On Kaliara, our waters are guided by currents that flow beneath the ground, singing through crystal tunnels. They are alive with ancient memories. Here the water runs free. It is refreshing." Dylan stepped closer, crouching at the edge of the creek, watching the water swirl around her ankles. He wondered what it was like to see Earth through Arya's eyes, to find beauty in every mundane detail. It made him feel self-conscious, aware of how narrow his own world had been before she arrived. He picked up a smooth stone and skipped it across the water's surface, watching as it bounced 3 times before sinking. Arya's eyes followed it, a look of curiosity in her gaze. "Show me how to do that," she said, her tone bright with eagerness. Dylan spent the next half hour teaching her how to skip stones, guiding her hands to find the right angle, the right flick of the wrist. She was a fast learner, her movements becoming more precise with each attempt. As the sun dipped lower, turning the sky into a canvas of oranges and purples, they found themselves sitting side by side on the creek bank, their laughter mingling with the sound of rushing water. In these moments, Dylan felt an ease he hadn't known in a long time, a sense that he was sharing a part of himself that no one else had ever seen. Arya, with her endless curiosity and gentle smiles, had a way of drawing out his thoughts, making him feel seen in a way that was both thrilling and terrifying. As the days passed, their bond grew deeper, shifting from casual conversations to something more profound. They spent hours in the old library where Arya devoured books on Earth's history, philosophy, and poetry, her eyes lighting up as she uncovered the intricacies of human thought. They explored the hidden corners of Ridgeview, places Dylan had never considered special, until he saw them through her eyes. The abandoned barn where wildflowers grew through broken floorboards, or the ridge overlooking the town, where the stars seemed close enough to touch. One evening they sat on the ridge, looking out at the lights of Ridgeview flickering below. The breeze stirred the air, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. Arya leaned back on her elbows, her face turned toward the night sky. "In my world, the stars have names that sing in our hearts," she said softly. "They are old, ancient beyond time, but they speak to us if we listen." Dylan glanced at her, drawn to the ethereal quality of her voice. "What do they say?" Arya turned to him, her gaze meeting his. For a moment, Dylan felt a twinge of something unfamiliar, a sense of connection, so deep it made his breath catch. "They speak of possibilities, of futures yet to be written," she replied. Her hand brushed against his, a touch so light it could have been accidental, but it sent a shiver through him. He found himself leaning closer, their faces inches apart. The moment stretched out, filled with the quiet hum of the night and the thrum of his own heartbeat. But then Arya pulled back, a flicker of something troubled crossing her expression. "We should return," she said quickly, standing up. Dylan nodded, masking his disappointment as he followed her down the hill. But the air between them was charged with unspoken words, with the electric tension of emotions that neither of them knew how to name. It was on a stormy night a few weeks later that everything changed. Rain lashed against the windows of the workshop, turning the world outside into a blur of shadows and water. Mark and Zyler were in the town, attending a meeting with a few officials to discuss Earth's ongoing integration with the galactic community. Dylan and Aria were alone in the house, sitting by the fireplace in the living room. Aria watched the flames dance, her expression thoughtful. Her aura, a faint shimmer of light that was unique to her kind, flickered like a second fire in the dim room. "There is a story on my world," she began, her voice low, almost hesitant, of two stars that fell in love from across the void, to travel toward each other, burning brighter as they drew near. But when they finally met, their light consumed them both. Dylan listened, feeling a strange tightness in his chest. "That's kind of a sad story," he said, but he couldn't look away from her. Aria turned to him, her expression unreadable, her eyes reflecting the firelight. Perhaps it's about a love so powerful it transformed them. They became something new, something unexpected. Before Dylan could respond, Aria reached out, her hand brushing against his cheek. Her touch sent warmth rushing through him, a heat that was more than physical. He felt as if she was touching his mind, his very soul. His breath caught, and for a moment, the world outside the storm, the distant rumble of thunder faded away. Their lips met, tentative at first, a brush of warmth and uncertainty. But then the kiss deepened, a connection sparking between them that felt like it had always been there, just waiting to be discovered. Dylan's hands tangled in Aria's silken hair, while her fingers traced the curve of his jaw, gentle yet insistent. They moved together, guided by an unspoken understanding, by the need to explore the strange, wonderful thing that had grown between them. Time blurred, the rain outside merging with the rhythm of their breathing, the crackling fire a distant echo of the heat between them. It was a moment suspended between worlds, a place where Earth and Kaliara met, where two souls found each other across the vastness of the universe. Dylan and Aria, caught in the thrumming pulse of the storm that lashed against the windows, found themselves drawn to each other in a moment of vulnerability and intensity. Sitting together by the fireplace, the warmth of the flames seemed to echo the unspoken emotions between them. Aria reached out, placing a hand on Dylan's cheek, her touch soft but electrifying, as if bridging a gap that had always existed between their worlds. Dylan inhaled sharply, feeling a rush of warmth at the contact, as if the air itself was charged with something new and uncontainable. Their faces moved closer, and the space between them disappeared. The first brush of their lips was tentative, hesitant, like two souls testing the waters of something unknown. But then the kiss deepened, and their connection grew into something more profound, a fusion of emotions and curiosity. It was a moment where the universe seemed to shrink, leaving only the two of them, exploring the delicate line between fear and longing, the barriers between their worlds dissolving like mist in the warmth of the fire. Their hands moved with gentle care, tracing each other's presence with a mix of awe and uncertainty. They discovered a closeness neither had known before, sharing a vulnerability that transcended their differences. Yet as the moments passed, they realized they were stepping into uncharted territory, a place where cultural boundaries and the unknown consequences of their actions loomed large, even as they clung to the fleeting beauty of the connection they had found. When reality returned, they pulled apart, breathless and wide-eyed, with the weight of what had just transpired hanging heavily in the air. Aria's expression was a blend of fear and wonder. As she hugged herself, her aura flickering like a candle in the wind. Dylan, feeling a deep uncertainty settle into his chest, reached for her hand and promised that they would face whatever came next, together. But in the silence that followed, both knew that their actions had set into motion something far beyond what they could control, the consequences of which would ripple through their lives like the quiet aftermath of the storm outside. "What have we done?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. She pressed a hand to her chest as if trying to steady her breathing, but her aura flickered erratically, casting strange shadows on the walls. But Dylan reached for her hand, his own trembling. "Aria, it's okay, we'll figure this out. Whatever this is, we'll face it together." But Aria shook her head, pulling away from him, wrapping her arms around herself. "You don't understand, Dylan. This isn't just about us. There are rules, there are consequences." He wanted to argue, to tell her that nothing mattered but what they felt, but deep down he knew she was right. This was uncharted territory, a path that neither of them had been prepared to walk. The weight of what they had done, of what it could mean, settled between them like the thick, humid air before a storm. So they sat there in silence, the fire burning low, with a chasm of uncertainty stretching between them. Outside, the rain finally stopped, leaving the night eerily still, as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for the moment when everything would change. Aria's demeanor shifted in the weeks that followed that stormy night. There was a new hesitance in her movements, a shadow of worry that seemed to linger in her eyes. She became more reserved, avoiding the familiar, easy conversations she and Dylan had shared. Instead, she spent more time alone in the woods behind the Everett house, sitting by the creek or wandering among the trees, her thoughts distant and unreachable. Dylan tried to ignore the growing sense of dread that twisted in his gut, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something had fundamentally changed. At first, Dylan attributed Aria's strange behavior to the natural adjustment of being on Earth. After all, she was a visitor from a distant world, grappling with human customs and the complexity of their situation. But soon subtle changes in Aria's physical presence began to surface, things that he could no longer explain away. Her aura, once a soft, barely perceptible glow, had grown brighter, fluctuating with a strange energy that crackled in the air around her. Dylan noticed that she became more sensitive to the environment. The scent of pine became too strong, certain earth foods made her recoil, and her reactions to cold seemed more pronounced. One evening, as they sat on the porch together, Dylan finally voiced the question that had been gnawing at him. "Aria, is everything okay? You've seemed different lately." Aria kept her gaze fixed on the horizon, where the last traces of sunlight painted the sky with bands of red and gold. For a long moment she said nothing, her fingers tracing the grain of the wooden railing beside her. Then she took a deep breath and turned to face him, her expression haunted by something deep and unnameable. "Dylan, there is something I must tell you," she said, her voice barely above whisper. Dylan felt his throat tighten as he braced himself for whatever revelation she was about to share. "What is it?" he asked, trying to keep his tone steady. Aria's hands trembled as she placed one over her abdomen, a gesture so human yet laden with alien uncertainty. I believe I am carrying a child, Dylan. Our child." For a moment the world seemed to tilt beneath Dylan's feet, the ground falling away in a dizzying spiral. He stared at her, uncomprehending, as if the words she had spoken were in some language he couldn't translate. How is that even possible?" he stammered, his mind reeling. Aria's eyes filled with a mixture of fear and wonder, of vulnerability that made Dylan's heart ache. "On my world, the process of life is different. Our bodies adapt to the environment around us, and the energies of the universe flow through us in ways that Earth has yet to understand. I did not think it possible for us to create life together, but it appears I was mistaken." Dylan's thoughts tumbled over each other, a chaotic blend of emotions: fear, disbelief, and a strange, terrifying excitement. He took a step back, running a hand through his hair, trying to process the enormity of what she was saying. "But what does this mean for you? For us? Aria, this isn't just something we can keep secret." Aria's face crumpled with the weight of the truth she had been carrying alone. "I know. I have been trying to find answers, to understand how this could happen, but there is no precedent for this in any of our histories. I fear what it means for my body, for the child, and most of all, for our families. Dylan, I am so afraid." Seeing the anguish in her eyes broke something in Dylan. He crossed the space between them in a heartbeat, pulling her into a tight embrace. Aria trembled against him, her hands clutching the fabric of his shirt, as if anchoring herself to reality. "We'll figure this out," he whispered fiercely. "We'll find a way, I promise." But as he held her, Dylan knew that the promise was a fragile one, stretched thin by the uncertainty of their situation. A human and an alien bound together by something that defied every rule of biology and culture. They were stepping into a realm where no one had gone before, and he had no idea what awaited them on the other side. The next few days were a blur of hushed conversations, frantic research, and growing desperation. Dylan scoured the internet for any mention of interspecies pregnancies, but all he found were science fiction stories and conspiracy theories. Aria attempted to use her telepathic abilities to seek out knowledge from distant Kaliaran archives, but even their advanced understanding of biology offered no answers for such an unprecedented situation. Aria's symptoms became more pronounced, their anxiety deepened. Her aura, once a gentle shimmer, had become an almost tangible presence, causing small disruptions in the electrical devices around her. Light bulbs flickered when she entered a room, and radios crackled with static. Aria's energy, Dylan realized, was not just growing, it was changing, evolving in ways that neither of them could predict. One afternoon, while Mark and Zyler were away at a conference with Earth's space agency, Dylan and Aria sat at the kitchen table, going through the few notes they had managed to compile. Aria's hand shook as she held a cup of tea, the steam rising in curling tendrils. "I can feel the life inside me, Dylan," she said, her voice tinged with awe and fear. "It is not like any child I have sensed before. Its essence is both human and Kiliaran, but there is something else, something new." So Dylan reached across the table and took her hand, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. "We need to tell them, Arya. We can't keep hiding this from our fathers." Arya met his gaze, her expression full of sorrow. "I am afraid of how my father will react. He has always believed in the purity of our ways, in the traditions that bind our people together. If he knew what we have done, what it means, he may not forgive me. And your father, he will think we have betrayed his trust." Dylan swallowed hard, knowing she was right. The bond between their fathers ran deep, built on years of diplomacy and shared dreams of bridging worlds. But this, what he and Arya had created together, was something neither of their fathers could have foreseen. It was not part of any treaty or alliance. It was something entirely, dangerously new. "Arya, we can't hide it forever," he insisted, squeezing her hand. "And the longer we wait, the worse it'll be. They might be angry, they might not understand, but they deserve to know." Before Arya could respond, a sudden noise from the hallway made them both jump. The sound of footsteps, heavy, deliberate, echoed through the quiet house. Dylan turned, his heart leaping into his throat as Mark and Xyler appeared in the doorway, their expressions grim with suspicion. It was clear they had heard enough to understand that something was amiss. "Dylan, Arya, what is going on?" Mark demanded, his voice tight with barely contained anger. His gaze flicked between his son and Arya, who had gone pale, her hands trembling in her lap. Xyler's eyes, usually filled with a calm, ethereal light, had hardened into shards of cold fire. He spoke in a low, dangerous tone, his voice resonating with an undercurrent of barely suppressed rage. "Arya, explain yourself. What have you been hiding?" Arya tried to speak, but her voice failed her. Dylan, seeing her fear, stepped forward, placing himself between his two fathers and Arya. "It's not her fault," he blurted out. It's mine. We didn't mean for it to happen, but Arya is, she's pregnant. We're having a child." The silence that followed was like a void, swallowing all sound. Mark's face went slack with shock, while Xyler's expression twisted into something that Dylan could only describe as betrayal. Arya shrank back, tears welling in her eyes as she struggled to hold herself together. Xyler's voice was a whip crack in the stillness. "You, what have you done?" He turned to Mark, his expression filled with accusation. "This is what you allowed to happen. You invited us here, and this is how your son repays our trust." Mark was too stunned to respond at first, his mind racing to make sense of what he had just heard. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low, strained rasp. "Dylan, how could you do? You have any idea what this means? The implications for Arya, for all of us." Dylan felt the weight of their words pressing down on him, crushing the air from his lungs. But he refused to back down. "I know it's not what you wanted, but this is our reality now. Arya and I, we love each other, and we're willing to face whatever comes. But we need your help. Please." For a moment, it seemed as if the room itself held its breath. Xyler's hands clenched into fists, his aura flaring with a dangerous intensity that made the air around him shimmer. Mark looked from Dylan to Arya, seeing the fear and determination in their faces, and something in his expression softened just slightly, like a crack in a wall. But before any resolution could be reached, Arya suddenly gasped, doubling over in pain. Her aura pulsed wildly, filling the room with a blinding electric light. Dylan rushed to her side, catching her as she sank to the floor. Xyler's fury melted into fear, and even Mark paled at the sight of the raw, alien energy crackling around her. "She needs help," Dylan shouted, panic clawing at his chest. "Please do something." Xyler knelt beside his daughter, his hands hovering over her, the glow of his own energy intertwining with hers as he attempted to stabilize the volatile surge. Mark, too, knelt down, his face tight with concentration as he tried to use his own rudimentary understanding of Kiliaran techniques to assist. For a moment, the world was a blur of light and shadows, of frantic whispers and desperate pleas. Arya clung to Dylan's hand, her breath coming in shallow gasps, her eyes wide with terror. Dylan held her tightly, willing her to hold on, to fight through whatever was happening to her. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the light faded, leaving the room plunged into darkness. Arya lay unconscious in Dylan's arms, her breathing ragged but steady. Xyler's hands trembled as he withdrew them, his expression a mix of anguish and disbelief. "It's true," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "She carries a life unlike any other. A bridge between our worlds." Mark looked at Xyler, then at Dylan, his face etched with a grim acceptance. "We can't turn back now," he said quietly. "We have to find a way forward together." But as they lifted Arya and carried her to a place where she could rest, Dylan knew that the path ahead would be fraught with dangers they could scarcely imagine. And somewhere deep within him, a cold fear took root, a fear that this child, this miracle they had created, might be the beginning of something far more complicated than any of them could comprehend. The days following Arya's collapse were fraught with tension, fear, and whispered conversations that lingered long into the night. The small Everett home seemed to creak under the weight of secrets too heavy for its wooden beams to bear. Arya remained bedridden, her body weakened by the surge of energy that had overwhelmed her. Dylan barely left her side, his face pale and drawn, as if he carried the exhaustion of the entire situation in his very bones. Mark and Xyler worked feverishly in the workshop, transforming it into a makeshift laboratory. It was a strange sight, earthly medical equipment mixed with Kaliaran devices that hummed with an eerie, otherworldly glow. Together they monitored Arya's condition, gathering data that was beyond any earthly understanding of biology. Mark's hands, calloused from years of manual work, moved with a new kind of precision, while Xyler's face, usually so composed, was lined with worry that betrayed the depth of his fear for his daughter. Dylan, however, was aware that their cooperation was fragile, built on a foundation that could crumble with a single misplaced word. The arguments between Mark and Xyler came often, hushed but heated, filling the house with an undercurrent of tension that gnawed at Dylan's nerves. He would hear them through the thin walls, words like reckless and irresponsible cutting through the stillness of the night. But beneath the anger there was something else, a shared desperation, a reluctant acknowledgement that the situation had grown beyond their control. One cold, clear morning, after a particularly sleepless night, Xyler approached Dylan in the small kitchen. The air between them was thick with unspoken words, but Xyler's expression was unreadable, his eyes glowing faintly in the dim light filtering through the window. "Walk with me," Xyler said quietly, gesturing toward the door that led to the woods behind the house. Dylan hesitated, but then nodded, following Xyler outside into the crisp autumn air. They walked in silence for a time, their breaths forming clouds in the cool morning, until they reached the edge of the creek where Dylan and Arya had often sat together. The water flowed gently, catching the early sunlight, casting ripples of gold across the rocks. Xyler turned to Dylan, his expression somber, his voice carrying a weight that Dylan had never heard before. "You love her, don't you?" "Oh." Dylan blinked, caught off guard by the directness of the question. "Yes," he admitted, the word leaving his mouth before he had time to second-guess it. He met Xyler's gaze, trying to convey the depth of what he felt. "I love her more than I've ever loved anyone. I know it's complicated, and I know it's not what either of you expected, but—" Xyler raised a hand, silencing him. "I am not blind, Dylan. I see the way you look at her, and the way she looks at you. Love between our peoples, it is not impossible, but it is rare, and it is never without consequences." Dylan felt his chest tighten. "I know this is hard for you, Xyler, but Arya and I were willing to face whatever comes. We just need your help. We can't do this alone." Xyler's expression softened, the lines of tension easing from his face. "I want to believe that, Dylan, but you must understand what this child represents. Arya is not just my daughter, she is a symbol of my people's traditions, of the legacy that we have upheld for centuries. And now she carries within her something that defies all of that, a life that is both Kaliaran and human, something that has never existed before." Dylan swallowed, feeling the enormity of Xyler's words settle heavily on his shoulders. "I get it. I do. But maybe that's not such a bad thing. Maybe this child, our child, could be a bridge between our worlds, a way to bring us closer." Xyler studied him for a long moment, his gaze piercing, as if searching for something in Dylan's face. Finally, he sighed, a sound that carried 1,000 unspoken fears. "I hope you are right, Dylan. For all our sakes, I hope you are right." Back in the house, Mark had gathered every resource he could find to help with Arya's pregnancy, reaching out to the few contacts he still had among Earth's scientific community. Most of these communications were veiled in secrecy, passed off as hypothetical discussions or obscure research projects. But a few trusted colleagues read between the lines, offering discreet advice, or agreeing to help under the condition of absolute confidentiality. One such ally was Dr. Elena Morris, a biologist who had worked with Mark in the early days of Earth's diplomatic relations with other planets. She arrived one rainy afternoon, her presence bringing a breath of hope into the tension-filled household. A tall woman with graying hair and a sharp mind, Dr. Morris possessed a calm, no-nonsense demeanor that reminded Dylan of his father in better times. Elena examined Arya with a mix of awe and professional detachment, taking notes on her glowing aura, the unusual energy readings that her body emitted, and the unique signs of pregnancy that defied earthly biology. Dylan watched from the doorway, a knot of anxiety twisting in his chest as he waited for Elena's assessment. When she finally stepped out of the room, Dylan followed her into the kitchen, where Mark and Zylar sat, their expressions tense with expectation. Elena closed the door behind her, folding her arms as she leaned against the counter. "This is unprecedented," she said, her voice tinged with disbelief. "Her body is adapting in ways I've never seen. It's as if the child inside her is drawing energy from both her and its surroundings, reshaping itself to bridge the differences between Kaliaran and human physiology." "What else?" Zylar's brow furrowed, his voice tinged with a cautious hope. "And what does that mean for Arya, for the child?" Elena hesitated, glancing between the three of them. "It means the pregnancy will be challenging, dangerous even, but it also means that the child is remarkably resilient, capable of adapting to the circumstances of its birth. If we're careful, if we monitor Arya closely, and provide her with the right support, there's a chance she and the baby could both survive this." Dylan's heart swelled with a hope he hadn't dared to entertain. He turned to Zylar, who remained silent, his expression inscrutable. Mark, too, seemed lost in thought, his gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the window, where the rain fell in a steady, drumming rhythm. Finally, Zylar exhaled, nodding slowly. "Very well. We will do whatever is necessary to ensure their safety. But if we are to do this, we must do it together." In the days that followed, the house transformed into a space of collaboration and care. Mark and Zylar worked together with a new sense of purpose, their old camaraderie rekindled by a shared goal. Elena oversaw Arya's health, blending her earthly expertise with Kiliaran techniques that Zylar taught her. And Dylan remained a constant presence by Arya's side, offering comfort and support even as he grappled with the uncertainty of what lay ahead. As Arya's pregnancy progressed, the challenges became more acute. Her energy surges grew stronger, requiring careful management to prevent them from overwhelming her body. The child's influence on her was unpredictable, manifesting in ways that left even Elena puzzled. Sometimes her skin would glow with a soft, otherworldly light. Other times she would lapse into periods of deep, trance-like sleep. One evening, as Arya lay resting in the bedroom, Dylan sat beside her, holding her hand. The room was dim, lit only by the gentle glow of a Kiliaran device that pulsed in time with Arya's breathing. He watched her, taking in the delicate rise and fall of her chest, the faint shimmer of her aura. Despite everything, the fear, the uncertainty, there was a peace in this moment, a quiet strength that filled him. Arya stirred, her eyes fluttering open. She gazed up at him, her expression softening as she reached out to brush a lock of hair from his forehead. "You're always here," she murmured, her voice tinged with a weariness that cut at Dylan's heart. "I don't know how you can be so strong." Dylan managed a smile, though it felt fragile on his lips. "I'm only strong because of you, Arya. You're the one carrying all of this, facing something no one has ever faced before. I'm just here, trying to hold it together for both of us." Arya's fingers tightened around his, a small but fierce gesture. "We will make it through this, Dylan. I believe that. Even if the future is uncertain, even if the stars themselves are against us, we will find a way." Her words filled him with a warmth that chased away the shadows in his mind. He leaned down, pressing his forehead against hers, feeling the gentle thrum of her aura against his skin. They stayed like that, finding strength in each other's presence, the unspoken promise of their bond alight in the darkness. The final weeks of Arya's pregnancy were a blur of urgency and tension, each day bringing new challenges and new hopes. The small team that had formed around her worked tirelessly, adjusting their plans with each unexpected development. But as Arya's due date approached, a new fear began to gnaw at them all, the fear that, despite their best efforts, they might not be prepared for what was to come. One cold night, under a sky scattered with stars, Arya's labor pains began. The house came alive with activity. Zylar and Elena gathered their equipment, Mark readied the room with an unsteady hand, and Dylan stayed close to Arya, his heart pounding in his chest. The air was thick with tension, every breath filled with the unspoken fear that they might not be able to guide her through this final perilous challenge. But Arya faced the pain with a quiet resilience, her face pale but determined as she clung to Dylan's hand. She called upon the ancient breathing techniques of her people, her aura flaring in response to the pain, filling the room with a soft golden light. Dylan held her, whispering words of encouragement, feeling the strength of her will seep into him like a lifeline. Elena and Xyler worked with a precision born of desperation, monitoring every fluctuation in Aria's energy, adjusting their methods as they guided her through each wave of pain. And then, as dawn broke over the horizon, the first cry of their child filled the room, a sound that echoed through the house like a promise. Dolan held his breath as Elena wrapped the newborn in a soft silver cloth, her expression filled with wonder. She placed the child in Aria's trembling arms, and Dylan felt tears prick at his eyes as he gazed down at the tiny, impossibly fragile life they had created. The baby had delicate features, a blend of human and Clearan traits, soft blue skin with faint, luminous patterns that glowed like constellations, eyes that held the deep, starry indigo of Aria's gaze, but with a curiosity that was all Dylan's. The child reached out, its small fingers brushing against Dylan's face, and he felt a rush of awe and joy that left him speechless. Aria looked up at Dylan, her face wet with tears, a radiant smile breaking through her exhaustion. "Our star child," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. A bridge between two worlds. Xyler stepped closer, his expression softened by a tenderness Dylan had never seen before. He placed a hand on Dylan's shoulder, a gesture of acceptance, of hope. Mark stood beside them, his face lined with fatigue but softened by a quiet pride. For a moment they were not human and alien, not father and son or diplomat and outsider. They were simply a family, united by the miracle they had brought into the world. As Dylan looked down at the child in Aria's arms, he felt a new determination settle within him, a promise that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. He reached out, placing a hand over Aria's, and together they held their child, watching as the first light of morning washed over the world outside, painting a new beginning on the horizon. The future was uncertain, filled with questions and dangers they could not yet foresee. But in that moment, beneath the rising sun and the soft glow of their child's aura, they felt a fragile, beautiful hope, a sense that perhaps they could forge a path between Earth and the stars, and that their story, like the dawn, was only just beginning.